afternoon all, and welcome to this episode of Critical Conversations. My name is Bernie Pelletier, and I am Program Director at Critical Connections. This show that we're doing today examines the enduring cultural, political, religious, and racial divisions that are fracturing our communities and focuses on the transformative role that citizens, like all of us, can play to address these divides. Recently in our season this year, post the election, we've had a former neo-Nazi, a Muslim extremist, and a law professor talking about the limits of executive orders. Today, we're going to explore the middle. We spend a lot of time on the fringes, but today we're going to try how do we bring these edges together. And in that regard, we are very fortunate today to be joined by Dr. Peter Coleman, who will help us understand the current political polarization in our country and will outline helpful approaches to seemingly intractable problems. And before I bring Dr. Coleman on, let me tell you a little bit about him. What I'm giving you now is a very abbreviated bio. It's actually a little intimidating to read, but I'll do my best. Dr. Peter Coleman is Professor of Psychology and Education at Columbia University, where he holds joint appointments at Teachers College and the Earth Institute. Dr. Coleman directs the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation, Conflict Resolution, and the Institute for Psychological Science and Practice at Teachers College, and is Executive Director of Columbia University's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, affectionately called AC to the Fourth. He currently conducts research on conflict intelligence and systematic wisdom as competencies for navigating conflict constructively, including a focus on adaptive negotiation and mediation dynamics, cross-cultural adaptivity, optimality of motivational dynamics in conflict, justice and polarization, multicultural conflict, intractable conflict, and as you'd hope after all of that, sustainable peace. Dr. Coleman, welcome to the program. And let me say on a personal note, I've been wanting to meet you ever since I picked up your book, 5%, Solving the Tractable Problems. It actually gave me hope that all this science that's taken us to this place can be used to sort of get us out of this place. So to start, maybe as a backdrop almost, it seems that we are more politically polarized than we've been perhaps since the Civil War, when it went beyond political polarization to bullets and trenches. Can you talk about why we're so divided now? What's led us to this situation? And does your research tell us anything that we wouldn't know without your research?
Good question. Well, Bernie, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And thanks for making your way through all the acronyms of all the organizations that I'm affiliated with. I know it's too much to say. Right. So it definitely, in this time in this country, but also to some degree around the world, it does feel like we're extremely polarized. And I want to kind of emphasize that it feels that way because it sort of depends on how you what you're measuring in terms of polarization, because there are some aspects of American life which surprisingly aren't as polarized as we think. So if you look at party affiliation and how strongly people are affiliated with Republican Democratic parties, it's actually been pretty stable for a few decades. Oh. If you look at ideologies of progressive and liberal, that too has been fairly stable and not really changed dramatically. And actually on the issues, on abortion, on gun rights, things of that nature, the attitudes on those issues have also been fairly stable in that, you know, they're basically normally distributed in this country. If you thought that they would be, for example, gun regulation issues, if you thought that they would be polarized, you'd see sort of two normal curves, but you just see one. So surprisingly, on those measures, we're not as polarized as you think. But if you look at other things, particularly at congressional voting patterns, Senate and Congress voting patterns, We have been increasingly more polarized since about 1981, in that people, senators, Congress people, tend not to cross the aisle and support the other party's legislation. So you see more and more oppositional voting patterns in our leadership, in our Congress. And then there are two other ways that we're polarized. So despite the political affiliations and the party affiliations and the ideology, there is a strong kind of set of camps that have grown up, which means that the issues all tend to correlate with each other. So if you have a certain position on the environment, certain issue on gun rights, certain position on the Muslim ban, those issues tend to cluster. And so you see people who support one issue support other issues along the same direction, right? So you see those kinds of camps that have emerged. So even though, party affiliation, ideology isn't there, the sort of tribal nature of these camps has increased considerably. And the personal animosity that people experience, that's one of the things that they've been able to measure actually since 1948, is how people feel about their own party and how they feel about the other party. And in those feelings, you see more and more of a sense of contempt for the other group and a more and more sense of loyalty and connection to your group. So emotionally and kind of in terms of your sense of identity, we are polarizing. And the issues that are associated with those camps tend to become very connected to one another and kind of feed each other, even though you don't see that on any particular issue or on the party affiliations. So there's a kind of a weird mix of things that are happening. But it's important to understand that, I think, because I think from our experience as Americans, when we watch the news, we do have a strong sense that this country is wide apart. And that's true on some dimensions, but it's not true on the others. And I think it's important to hold all of that in your mind. And that's part of what our science has taught us, that in times like this, when you see long patterns, for example, of congressional voting opposition, these issues, all the distinctions, it used to be that you could have a conservative that would be liberal on some issues. You would have a progressive that would have some conservative financial positions, right? Now you tend to see these things collapse really into more simplistic us versus them sort of tribal camps. It is an emotional dynamic primarily, and it is a collapse of the sort of nuance and complexity of life, right? Because life is a complicated thing, but we just start to support our team and to some degree vilify the other team. And there are a host of psychological dynamics that happen, and social dynamics, and the media is playing a critical role, and what politicians do to divide us and to basically, increase their own power plays a role. So there are a lot of factors that come into play in this. But at the end of the day, what happens is that we start to see and feel that the world is this very simple, polarized place. And that's a dangerous place to be.
That's absolutely fascinating, and I absolutely didn't understand that the normal curves of sort of attitudes on gun control and abortion, et cetera, have sort of stayed the same. So it's
pretty stable over a few decades, yeah.
It's
surprising, right?
Because it is very surprising.
You'd think with the discourse that with the main media messages that are coming out, that we are much farther apart on these issues, but that's not what the data tells us. It's just what it feels like, and it's what's reflected oftentimes in the media. And
maybe that emotionality is part of the key. And your research, when I look at your team, you're a psychologist and an educator. You've got an astrophysicist. I think you've got a variety of hard science and so-called soft science.
Yeah.
And you're studying intractable problems, at least in this book. I think you've actually broadened since 2011 when you wrote that book.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting to just maybe lay out for our audience, what is an intractable problem? How is it different than a typical problem? Because I think, speaking for myself, I tend to go at things. We have a problem, I'll go in and fix it. I get my fix-it kit and I'll do my thing. And I haven't been able to do that for 2 years. A lot of what used to work for me doesn't work. And so my suspicion is that we're in one of these intractable problems, and these things you call attractors seems to have caught at least some of us, myself included, in this gravitational pull. So could you sort of lay out your theory on that intractable?
Sure, happy to. So we started to study this probably about 12, 15 years ago, and we are studying conflicts that become stuck for very long periods of time. So the good news on this is that the vast majority of conflicts that we face in our personal lives, in our professional lives, even politically, are resolved effectively. We find ways to negotiate or to tolerate the difference or to just sort of ignore the conflict and move on. Most of the time that's true. But there's a small percentage, and in the book, I call the book the 5%, because in the international domain, in interstate relations, about 5% of the more difficult conflicts that take place between nations get stuck into a contentious, oftentimes military set of a competitive dynamic and competitive exchange. And they can sometimes get stuck for generations, 30, 40, 50 years. And so those are the things that we've studied. They're conflicts that don't seem to change despite good faith attempts to resolve them. So Israel-Palestine is a classic example of a conflict that is somewhere between 50 and 100 years, depending on how you count it, and where there have been many good faith attempts by Israelis and Palestinians, by the US, by the international community to go in, broker treaties, broker understandings, affect change. There's peace building work on the ground, there's other people that come in from the outside, there are local people that are doing good work, and yet you see this to some degree either stalemate with some escalation and de-escalation of violence taking place for decades. And so those are the kinds of things that we study that aren't responsive to typical problem-solving methods, right? So we've learned a lot over the past 80 years as kind of systematic study of negotiation and mediation and diplomacy of how to work most conflicts out. Trade disputes, land disputes, even ideological disputes sometimes. We've found processes that help us do that, and the international community has gotten better and better at that. But there is this small percentage of disputes that get stuck. And so this group that you referred to, we called them the Dynamical Systems Team, and it was a group, it was political scientists and anthropologists, a couple of psychologists, a physicist, all came together and worked for about 5 or 6 years to try to think differently about these things, realizing that they don't behave like other conflicts, they don't respond to good faith attempts to work them out. So we really tried to start to apply ideas from applied mathematics and physics to think of these as systems that get stuck and that are sort of self-reinforcing, and no matter if you change policies or if you try to negotiate them or if the leadership changes or if they're big or if the issues go away, you still see these dynamics stay in place. Mm-hmm. And this idea of attractors that you talk about it's something from applied mathematics. It's really just the idea that if you measure anything over time, oftentimes you can see patterns in the data that don't seem to change. So John Gottman is a marital therapist, and he brings couples into the lab, and he'll have them talk about something that is a conflict for them. And if he measures them at time 1 and a week later and a month later and a year later, he sees that they move into pretty common patterns, right? And those patterns are attractor patterns. And they're caused by a lot of different things, but what matters is that that's what they fall into. Those are the habits they fall into. I often refer to siblings because people understand when they go back and see their siblings, those dynamics from 20, 30, 40 years ago are still alive and well. And you, despite your good faith intentions to be different this time, we oftentimes go and fall into these patterns. And those are attractor patterns. And mathematicians have used that idea both as kind of a metaphor for how to think about problems differently, but also they've been able to understand some of the mathematics underneath them to work both in qualitative ways to understand them differently, but also in quantitative ways to say, well, what are the things that change these? So we've been trying to infuse new insights and new ideas into these long-term destructive conflicts, which happen in families, right? They happen in families, they happen in communities, and they happen in nations and between nations. So they happen at all different scales. They're not common, but when they do happen, they tend to create a lot of misery, a sense of resentment and contempt and hostility, and affect us physically, affect, you know, what kind of resources we have to put into these things. They're very destabilizing when they happen, right?
Absolutely.
So that's what we've been sort of paying attention to for, as I said, about the last 10 or 15 years. And that's what we've written a lot on this. This is one of the books that we wrote that has some practical relevance for what do you do when you face these things.
It may be the case that one reason I found this book so interesting and attractive, no pun intended, was I am a mathematician by training,
yeah.
and I do have my share of intractable family problems. So
Sure.
I found it appropriate on both counts. I guess I would like to, with that sort of, and I know broad brush and
Sure.
rushed theoretical explanation, really kind of bring it home. We're sitting here in Amherst, Massachusetts, perhaps one of the most liberal bastions on the East Coast.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you from the audiences that we've attracted on our Critical Connections sessions, people are passionate.
Yeah.
And people are being brave, and they are saying we have to get up, we have to speak truth to power. We cannot let a lot of what we see happen. We're going to go out in the streets, we're going to do this.
Yeah.
We're not going to let, if we have to stand in front of a tank, a la Tiananmen Square, we'll do that, hopefully.
Sure.
We don't. At the same time, I force myself to look at the other side. I look at NRA videos, and when I watch an NRA video, I see some of I was in the Women's March, I see footage from these protests being used by them. Mm-hmm. I'm going to just say legitimately or not with deceit, mm-hmm. as proof that their members need guns. So my mm-hmm. hard question to you is, question A is, can we both stand up and not get rolled over, but not make things worse?
Yeah.
And does your research tell us anything different from what you see happening? Mm-hmm. Those are tough questions.
Sure, that's fine. And that's why we're here, right?
Yeah.
These are tough problems. So yeah, I have a couple of responses. So you know the phrase, and so I'm speaking to the progressive camp right now, right?
Yep.
And you know the phrase that it takes a village. And I think of progressivism as it takes a network, that there are different roles that different people can play in that network. We definitely need to, speak truth to power. We need to protest. We need to stand up and do the right thing. And so provocation, civil disobedience, nonviolent, those are oftentimes necessary in times like this when we feel like our rights are being violated or the rights of others are being violated, particularly vulnerable populations. So I want to sort of say that that is a baseline, and there's room for many others to be able to try to reach across and start to communicate and start to have a different kind of conversation. So there's a need for all of that. It's sometimes hard for any one person to play all of those roles, because as soon as you start to become more provocative and more challenging, you're categorized and you're discounted. So I think the left would benefit from thinking about itself as a network of affiliates that need to play different roles in this time. Did you want to respond to that?
No, that's starting to, you're
make some sense.
It's starting to make a little sense, yes.
Okay. So there is we've been working with an idea in our lab called optimal tension, that when there are problems that need to be addressed, oftentimes those in power, the dominant, or the dominants, don't pay much attention, and there's usually good reason to pay attention. Oftentimes they're distracted, they're in charge, there's a lot of demands on them, but also to pay attention to the concerns of those in lower power, makes them feel guilty, and they maybe have to make some amends and start to address these issues. And so they tend not, even good faith people tend not to pay attention. So it oftentimes takes students and younger people and others to organize and draw attention to those things that happened in South Africa with Mandela originally, with the nonviolent civil disobedience movement. It happens, that's how change oftentimes happens in society. That is a necessary component. But when it gets too tense, too violent, too threatening, oftentimes it's shut down. It's met with this kind of sometimes oppressive response. So the question for us is, if you're an internal person, if you work at Amherst, if you work at Columbia University, and you're interested in promoting change, how can you do it so that you keep the issues on the table, you keep the attention to the issues that need to be attended to, but not so much that it destabilizes and it sort of shuts down the process. So that's one of the, it's an artistry, but I think effective activists, effective politicians, effective leaders can find that. They can find a way to keep more difficult, provocative issues on the table without them being so disorienting or so alarming to those in power that it really sort of shuts the system down and shuts the process down.
It's almost, the image that's coming to my mind is almost like the leader is connected to his group by a rubber band. And if he pulls too far, too fast,
it snaps, yeah.
And then you get into a very unstable situation.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen some of that.
Yeah. In our leadership, you mean?
Well, in our leadership, and I think on both sides of the equation.
Yeah.
I think Charlottesville. I don't want to diminish that, but it clearly seems like that one snapped. On both sides, perhaps. Yeah,
I think that's right. I mean, I think that one of the challenges for progressives in this time is that I think we do tend to make the same errors are made on both sides, frankly, where we start to assume a kind of monolithic other, that all of them, conservatives,
Absolutely.
Republicans, are the same, and that's, again, part of what the data shows, is that when you ask people, they think the other side is unintelligent, they're selfish, and increasingly we think that they're undermining the country, them being whatever other group that you're not in. And that is concerning, because the truth is that today there's a lot of divisions within the progressive movement. There's a lot of divisions within the more conservative movement, right? Absolutely. Big divisions. And in some ways that offers a sort of unique opportunity for this country to regroup and find some common ground, because I think that there are allies that have common concerns on both sides for the future of the country. And for our capacity to address the more difficult challenges that we need to address. And you see people responding to that in different ways. Today, a congressman decided that he was going to step away. An Ohio congressman is going to sort of leave midterm because he's sort of fed up with Washington and fed up with what his party's doing. And that is one way of at least signaling through protest, right? Leaving may not be the best strategy, but definitely draws
snap.
Yeah, but it definitely draws attention to those tensions within that system. So I think that assuming the other is a monolith and they're all alike and disparaging them, that's an emotional reaction, and I understand it, but ultimately it doesn't get us very far, because it means that we really don't see any ways to build bridges and to identify common ground and to ultimately work together.
On the topic of common ground, Abraham Lincoln, Civil War.
Yeah.
Thanksgiving was his creation, with the explicit idea of we're all eating, and most people like turkey. Let's do something as Americans.
Yeah.
And the calendar would have us look at Thanksgiving again.
Yeah.
And I know I face Thanksgiving with my disparate family with a certain degree of trepidation. You've recently written an article for Yes Magazine where you have 10 steps to get safely through the holiday season without causing any damage.
Right.
So that we give value to our listeners of a personal sort. Maybe could you give us a couple tips to get through Thanksgiving?
Yeah, and Thanksgiving I think is a great example celebration or holiday, because it isn't about things, it isn't about gifts, it is really just about time together and food, right? And
exactly.
and appreciating what you have. I mean, I think that if you're anxious about going to your family and having these conversations, I think that's good. because I think that's normal. I think that we're in a time of high anxiety, and our anxiety is fed by the media, it's fed by some of our leaders, and so we should be feeling those kinds of feelings. And it's really important to be mindful of how emotional this dynamic is between the sides, between the camps, right? That there are these very powerful emotions. And conflicts that are organized around emotions like that are usually not amenable or susceptible to facts, to logic, to talking points, right? So if you go in armed to the teeth with statistics and facts and figures, you're not going to get very far. Really, these conflicts and these conversations go best when there is some sense of rapport, there is some sense of friendship, some sense of history and positivity that you either can rely on from the past or that you can try to establish out of the gate, because that's the only way that people open up enough to actually hear new things, and not just try to close and look for the talking point that they can counterpoint with their argument, right? So, and those are fundamentally different communication processes. There are, when we try to persuade others, we shut down our learning and we really look for confirming evidence and ways to, basically win our argument. And the opposite of that is dialogue, where you open up your learning and try to listen and hear from the other side. So I think that's a critical component, is really being able to listen and learn from the other. And there's one fundamental, what we call implicit theory, that affects that. So people hold implicit theories about others and about situations. And if you believe that the other, your uncle, your friend, your brother, if you believe that they're never going to change, then you're absolutely right. In that dynamic, they're never going to change. They found in Israel-Palestine that when Israelis hold the belief that Palestinians will never change, the conflict will never change, that they disengage from negotiations, they disengage from the other, and there's more hostility and enmity towards the other side. When they believe that there is the possibility that the next generation will come along and that there could be change, if they believe that, they're much less hostile, much less anxious engaging with the other, and much more willing to try to reach across and work things out. So just holding on to that simple belief is one way to help you start the conversation, and how you start it goes a long way to shaping how it will move.
So I think that's a wonderful thing to go out on, is to start with friendship, start believing that it can change, and pass the cranberries. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for spending time with us. I hope this critical conversation is informative and useful, especially during this holiday season. Please join us again. Thank you.